Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be talking about symptoms of a recession and how that relates to the US economy. So right now the US economy is doing very, very well. Unemployment is at a 40-year low, and inflation isn't necessarily keeping up, and there's a lot going on in the US economy right now that's doing very well. So it may seem counterintuitive to think in terms of recessions if the economy is doing so well. But bear with me, because there are a couple of signs that are telling of what a recession is, and I think the US economy is following in that path in a way. But before I delve too much into that, let's talk about what a recession actually is. So a recession is when there is negative GDP growth over two succeeding quarters. So they're seen typically as cyclical, which is to say that the behavior of a recession is somewhat predictable. There are some signs that are forthtelling on whether or not a recession will happen within the next 12 months or a couple years. In the case of 2008, it was the subprime mortgage bubble that was forming, and in 2001, it was the dot-com burst. So that was when the internet and technology companies, there was a bubble that formed that eventually burst, and of course the stock market, or not really the stock market, but a recession occurred shortly thereafter. But with 2008, it was much more severe, and unemployment was in the double digits. But I'm not going to dwell too much on those specific examples, but it is actually worth keeping a note that a recession, you can tell whether or not it's going to be coming if there's a bubble forming. That's not to say that I believe a bubble is forming right now in the US economy, but we'll get more into that, like how I feel about that a little later. But first, I'm going to discuss with you the first sign that a recession is on the horizon. So that is called inverted yield curves. So this, by far, is the most telling sign if a recession is going to be occurring in the near term. But first, what are inverted yield curves? Well, it's simply when bonds with shorter durations are selling higher than the yield on, or when the yield on bonds with shorter durations are higher than the yield on bonds with longer durations, which is to say that shorter duration bonds are selling quicker than longer bonds. So this actually implies that the demand is higher for short-term investments, which is to hint towards the fact that, excuse me, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Which is to say that investors believe that the long run for investments is much riskier than the short run. And as a little side note here, I put short-term Treasury bill yields track. Let me say that one more time. Short-term Treasury bill yields track the Fed fund rates. This little thing that you should kind of watch out for, Treasury bills. Actually, one more thing as well. The bonds issued by the government, if those invert as well, that's actually a very bad sign as well. That's actually an even worse sign. But okay, so getting into this little graphic here, so as you can see, it displays the basis points and the timeline on the x-axis. So for US yield curves, they're now dropping below zero, so where they're inverting. In 2007, the end of 2000, beginning of 2007, we saw that yield invert because, of course, with the subprime mortgage crisis. But right now, we've seen the yield on 3-year notes and 5-year notes the spread was negative 0.01 basis points. And this occurred near the end of 2018, December. So yeah, the inversion has already happened in December 2018. We've seen it happen already, albeit negative 0.01 basis points, but we still saw an inversion nonetheless. But this isn't sign for concern if it weren't for the fact that we saw yet another inversion with a wider spread. That occurred in March of 2019, and the spread between 3-year and 5-year notes was negative 0.03 basis points. So we've seen it invert twice, and it is sign for concern a little bit, just to be wary. And I feel we'll get into this a little in the next topic, but I feel like that is somewhat exacerbated by the trade war going on between the United States and China, and also the recent the recent tariffs being threatened towards the EU by the United States. So that may play a role into it, but just keep this in mind that bond yields, if you see them invert, usually that's a cause for concern. And we've already seen that happen twice already. The second symptom of a recession is credit monitoring. So if we see, lenders are being more cautious on who they're lending money to, it may indicate that there will be a slowdown in economic activity. So interestingly, prices for U.S. imports have declined by 0.2% in May, as of May of 2019, while prices for exports have declined by 0.3% in the same month. I believe that this, again, was exacerbated by the trade war. And this is, it is what it is, but the reason why this is important, taking a look at the trade part of an economy, is because it may translate, it won't directly translate, but it may translate directly to the relationship between trade and market conditions, because that can escalate to a point of jeopardy, which will cause firms to become more capital protective. So if a firm's more capital protective, they're going to be less willing to lend out money to people who are trying to borrow. So if that were the case, and if that were to materialize, this could translate to the lending of money being less mobile. So credit monitoring, right now, I can't really say for sure if firms are becoming much more capital protective due to the trade war, or that it even will translate to the lending of money being less mobile. But I think that it's worth pointing out, at least, that the prices for U.S. imports are declining, and the prices for exports are also declining. And this kind of this relationship between trade and the market can escalate. It could, if it wanted to. So I feel like that's something to keep in mind, especially given the fact that the trade war between the United States and China doesn't really see an end in sight per se. Now, there was that G20 summit where they are kind of calling a truce or what have you, but that's definitely not something where we should keep our hopes up, because it's only a truce, it's nothing more. So credit monitoring in general, it makes sense because less money is going out because people are more cautious on the future that the economy holds. To move on to the third topic is called the labor market. So it really depends on the acceleration of economic downturn, but there are some things that you should keep in mind, such as unemployment, consumer price index, producer price index. These are all useful things in analyzing the health of the market. If CPI is in a good position, then people are able to afford things, and that would stimulate the economy. Likewise, if input prices are somewhat affordable for firms, then there would be much more goods and services being provided, and a variety of goods and services being provided to the consumers. So this all translates pretty much to the economy just spinning and spinning, and people putting money in and getting money out. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, unemployment. Unemployment right now is 3.6%. Those are the latest numbers that I have found. And of course, this is great because there's less people that are unemployed. And, that will, of course, again, stimulate the economy because people are getting money and they're putting it back into the economy. So that's obviously good. And if there is a healthy labor market, then there's a lower probability that there will be economic slowdown. But despite this, there's still caveats to the numbers. So, for instance, unemployment right now is 3.6%. But despite that, if we were to look at, in theory, okay, so to back up just a little bit, in theory, if unemployment is low, inflation should move in the opposite direction in a proportional manner. So we call that the Phillips curve. So it essentially states that unemployment and inflation are inverses of one another. So they move in opposite directions. So when one goes down, the other goes up, vice versa. Right now, we haven't seen inflation actually increase to the extent in which unemployment is decreasing. It has to a certain extent, like it always does, and it will. But right now, we haven't seen that fully materialize yet. And a lot of people are calling foul on that specific point, saying that, it's kind of, it sometimes works and sometimes it's applicable to some economies. In other economies, it doesn't fully come to fruition. But by and large, that is always going to be the case between inflation and unemployment. They're always going to behave in an inverse relationship. So while we haven't seen inflation fully get out of hand for the consumer market, it doesn't mean that it won't happen. And it really honestly could. And it could especially happen if, again, I like to point to the trade war, but it's true because I talked about this in another video, but if the trade war continues, then consumer surplus will decrease. And it will decrease disproportionately to the increases in producer surplus and the gains that the government receives through the revenue of tariffs. So I would say it's only a matter of time before before the behavior of the Phillips curve comes to fruition. And while unemployment is super low, inflation will catch up eventually, in my opinion. So essentially, I want to conclude this with the fact that the Federal Reserve is measuring the probability of a recession occurring the next year at 25%. So if I were to just summarize what I said, if bond yields invert once again with a wider spread, and we continue to see this trade war between the United States and China, and it may even be worse if there are tariffs implemented towards the EU, and we see that the Federal Reserve cut rates by 100 basis points or more, then I have to dissent to the high likelihood that a recession will occur within the next year or two. And the reason why this is so apparent to me, at least, is because we have already seen the bond yields invert, not once but twice, and each time they have inverted, they've inverted with a wider spread. The trade war doesn't seem as though it will come to an end within the next year. While we did see that G20 summit, there wasn't any solutions that were proposed. It was only kind of like truce or what have you. It wasn't a deal or anything. So the tariffs are still occurring, and they may even occur with the EU, which will be who knows how how much we can squeeze the government's or economic surplus with these tariffs. But I also want to point out to the Federal Reserve cutting rates by 100 basis points. This is actually already up for discussion. The Federal Reserve is considering that amount, which is quite a bit, because you wouldn't ordinarily see that the Federal Reserve would cut rates by that much if they didn't think that some economic troubles were ahead. 100 basis points is quite a bit, and it would be more reasonable, at least if the economy is doing as well as people say it is, if they cut rates by like 50 basis points or something of that nature. But in actuality, like, if the economy is doing so well, the Federal Reserve should either keep rates the way they are or even raise them. But since we aren't seeing even a hint of conversation towards raising rates, they're probably more than likely right now going to cut rates, and depending on how much of a cut it is going to indicate whether or not they truly believe, at least, that the economy is going to be heading towards slowdown or a recession, something of that nature. So that's how I feel about right now, at least with the U.S. economy. Again, this is more of my perspective on the matter. I could be totally wrong, and it could be just, things could be going great and things continue to go great. But I think that it's worth pointing out these symptoms, these signs of a recession that ordinarily occur. But we'll just have to wait and see how the market responds and what the Federal Reserve does, and if how the trade war is gonna continue. But aside from that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.